All right, so we're going to get into a little bit more of the strategy behind the war itself. But even as we do so, just keep in mind that this is not a military history class. Although I think a military history class would be interesting. For the purposes of APUSH, we want to take a broad view here and think about, causes, consequences, things of that nature. So, with that in mind, keep these ideas at the front of your mind. To what extent did the French and Indian War maintain continuity and foster change and the relationship between Great Britain and the 13 colonies, and then also be able to explain the intellectual and political causes of the American Revolution? So let's think about tactics, some advantages, some disadvantages, etc. So, American advantages and tactics. Well, militia guerrilla tactics. They know the territory better than the redcoats, the British forces, right? And they're going to use the natural environment to their advantage. American disadvantage, though, is that they don't really have, or they don't have, well trained regular army or officers. So it is sort of a ragtag crew that the colonies are relying on. The Americans are familiar with the territory and the environment, and they feel really that all they have to do is drag it out. If they can drag this war out, that the British people will lose their appetite for it, and the British will just go home. And to be honest with you, they're not wrong in that. But if they want to drag it out, they're going to actually need some funding and some supplies, and they don't have either of those things. And in the beginning, the support among the population of the colonies is really small. And they are going to hope for support from Britain's enemies, although we know that won't really materialize. So advantages for the British versus disadvantages for the British. Well, 11 million versus 2.5 million in terms of population. That's a pretty significant population advantage. But the war is really popular at home. So there might be more people at home, but they don't like the idea of the war, especially as time goes on. War debt and war fatigue are a big factor in that dislike. They do have a disciplined and experienced army, and they also have the world's largest navy. But American privateers are going to really sort of render the Navy a non-issue or a non-factor in the Revolution for the British. They also already have forts and troops that are garrisoned or stationed in America. And they still have some support inside the colonies. You have loyalists, you have natives, and then you have slaves forced to fight with the loyalists. They're spread very thin. They're trying to put out a lot of fires. Oh, well, I'm not going to go through all this again. They're trying to put out a lot of fires at the same time, and it's going to lead to a very difficult wartime experience for the British in America. So let's talk about patriots, loyalists, and neutrals. So patriots are often referred to during this time as the Whigs. They support independence, but they might not all agree on the course of action. So just because I'm a patriot doesn't mean I want to go to war. It might just mean I want to boycott, write a petition or something. But eventually they do come to advocate for independence based on rhetoric, based on education, which many colonists are very well educated, and also this idea of rights and liberties. Tories or loyalists are going to maintain their loyalty to the crown. They also disagree about the taxes, but they are against separating themselves from Britain. They are worried about the Americans winning because they are worried about what will happen to their economic prosperity. Many of the loyalists are recent British immigrants. You tend to be more loyal to Britain if you just got to America than if you're, generation or so removed from your immigrant parents or grandparents. There are also lots of people who are neutral. They don't really care. Maybe they're far away from the action. Maybe economically they're afraid to choose a side because they're worried about the consequence from the other side when the war is over. And if you look at the map on the right, you sort of see where the loyalist strongholds are. several in cities in the South. That Southern economy is really dependent on exporting their agricultural supplies back home, but there are a whole lot of patriot strongholds as well. Is foreign assistance going to come? So potentially from two places. We have Baron Frederick Wilhelm von Steuben, who's a German, and Marquis de Lafayette, who is French. They don't so much care about America as much as they would like to see the British humiliated and maybe economically punished. If you remember, the French and the British had just fought a war in which France was on the losing end. And there's a really famous quote when the Americans come to the aid of the French in World War II. It's World War I or World War II? I'm blanking. But the Americans famously say, the general says, "Lafayette, we are here," referring to the help, the financial aid that in particular the Marquis de Lafayette provided, that France provided for the Americans during the Revolution. But then the Germans also provided both financial aid, and also German mercenaries came and fought in the American Revolution as well on the side of the colonists. So here's the actual war. Boston and New York are under British control and conquest. You have the Battle of Trenton, the Battle of Princeton, the Battle of Saratoga, and of course the Valley Forge, that Winter Valley Forge from 1777 to 1778. In the South, you have Lord Cornwallis's strategy, the Battle of Camden, Cowpens, and Yorktown. These are all important battles. These are all battles that may come back and be asked questions about on the test. So I want to make sure that you pay special attention to these particular ones as you're reading. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 is going to end the war. Yet another Treaty of Paris. It's fascinating to me. Just 20 years after the Treaty of Paris, in which the colonists were aligned with the British, ended the 7 Years' War, the Treaty of Paris of 1783 sees the colonists separate from Britain. It's going to be brokered by John Adams, by Benjamin Franklin, who was way too much fun in Paris, as we know, and also by a man named John Jay. The British will recognize the United States of America. The United States of America will grant all lands east of the Mississippi, is granted all lands east of the Mississippi. Natives are nowhere in the treaty at all, even though they had fought. States apply their own self-interests, and they ask the British to remain in Northwest forts to protect them from the natives. So that's always a little interesting point, that yes, the Americans are free, but there is still going to be at least a small military presence in the Americas. So now what? So we have talked for a while now, right? It's almost mid-September at this point, and we just now have the United States of America. So finally, in AP U.S. history, we are actually talking about the United States. There's my cat meowing into the microphone. So you guys let me know if you have any questions on this.